I have a big problem. Or I guess maybe I should say that I have a small problem, or I guess the most accurate thing to say would be that I have a space problem. You see, a few months ago, we moved into this new place, and while we love it here, a lot of my furniture doesn't really fit in the new living room. The QR code table is way too big and makes the whole space feel cramped. So I started thinking, how can I redesign this space? And then it just kind of hit me. We're all doing living rooms completely wrong, and we're all wasting a ton of space as a result. So today, I want to completely make over this living room, cram a whole bunch of tech in here, and hopefully revolutionize the way people think about home theaters. Sound like fun? All right, let's get our hands dirty. The very first thing I had to do on this project was just remove everything from the living room, including this little freeloader. Nothing was spared. The coffee table, gone. The carpet, gone. And unfortunately, my media console too. As much as I love this thing, it's taking up needless space and creating a lot of visual clutter. Plus, as you can see, my TV didn't really fit on it anyways. But if there's no media console, well then where does the TV go? That's where this wall mount comes in. By wall mounting the TV, I was able to push it back 6 to 8 inches and free up some much needed square footage directly beneath it. I was also able to fix the biggest ergonomic mistake most people make when setting up their TVs. I set the height of my TV so that the center of it was at the same height as my eye line when I'm sitting on the couch. That way I don't have to look up or down to watch it. It's just right there in the neutral position. Next, I rolled out a new, much larger carpet and under carpet pad. And its inclusion in this video isn't just an excuse to write it off of my taxes. It's actually going to be an integral part of making this whole project work. Plus, its lighter color should help to make the whole room feel more open and clean. With all of that taken care of, I temporarily reset up the living room and took a second to appreciate just how much of a difference I had already made. Simply by wall mounting the TV, we've regained some pretty significant square footage, but it's also introduced a couple of problems. Like, what am I gonna do with my PS5, Xbox, and audio-visual receiver? And also, that coffee table is just way too big. So let's head to the shop and see what we can do about those. As you probably already guessed, a new coffee table is the first order of business. And rather than wasting all that space underneath it, I decided to fully enclose it and transform it into a high-tech hub that will power the rest of the room. And the first step towards that goal was ripping a bunch of 3/4 inch white oak plywood. Now, a lot of people would just start nailing together the box at this point, but I'm going to show you a little trick that will take your next sheet good project to the next level. By cutting a series of rabbets into the outside edges of the plywood, I was able to create a box that fits together like a puzzle. Not only will this make it stronger, but it'll also make the assembly a heck of a lot easier too. A little bit of glue in all of the joints, clamp it all together, and then fire some pins into the corners to hold everything while the glue sets. The last thing I did was cut a single solid panel that will be the bottom of the coffee table, and then I dropped it perfectly into place. I said perfectly into place. There we go. All right, so that's our box made. I'm not going to install this bottom on it just yet because I want to cut a couple of things on it on the CNC, but first, let's make some legs. These legs are going to pull double duty. Not only will they cover the nasty raw plywood edges of our box, but they'll also lift the bottom of the table up about an inch off of the floor and give us a space to intake air from. My design here was really simple. I started with some 2-inch by 2-inch lengths and then cut out a 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch section. This is what they look like when they were done. And installation was equally simple. I applied some glue and then pin nailed each of the 4 legs to a corner. And don't worry about the nail holes, a little bit of color match wood filler will make those disappear later. If you look closely, you can see that I'm actually using little spacer blocks to elevate everything as I'm installing the legs. And that's just because I wanted to leave some room for an interior trim that will run the whole way around the perimeter of the box. This little L-shaped piece of oak will again cover some raw plywood edges and create a concealed cove where I can install some LED lighting. But we'll talk more about that later. For now, just like with the legs, I applied some glue and then nailed my new trim in place. That is the main box done. And while we still have to do the bottom on the CNC, like I said before, I think at this point, I'd like to do something a little bit artistic. All right, so this is the point in the project where things take a bit of a stressful turn, and I think it's a great opportunity to talk about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. Trying to balance running multiple businesses, my personal relationships, and trying to tackle these building projects can often be very stressful. And if I'm honest, at times can give me a lot of anxiety. But thankfully, when I was younger, I spent a lot of time working with a therapist to develop skills to properly manage those feelings. and I think it's one of the best things that I ever did. BetterHelp is on a mission to make therapy more affordable and accessible for everybody. Finding a therapist can often be hard and expensive. So what BetterHelp did was create an online platform where you can be matched with a professional therapist in as little as a few days by just answering a few questions. Once you're matched with someone, you can do sessions via the phone, webcam, or even live chat if you don't feel comfortable with the other options. Heck, you can even text your therapist if you need to. And because it's all remote, you can do it from anywhere and you don't have to go to a therapist's office. BetterHelp is a great service and it can really help you take charge of your mental health. So if you want to sign up, I put a link down in the video description, or you can go to betterhelp.com/zachbuilds to get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. Clicking that link is a great way to support the channel and really to support yourself. All right, now let's get back to building this table and I'll explain what I meant by doing something a bit artistic. The easy thing to do here would have been to just glue together a bunch of pieces of oak into a panel that looked a little something like this. But I wanted to do things a bit differently, and my plan called for some serious precision. So before I cut anything, I made sure that my table saw was set at exactly 90 degrees. Then I started ripping a bunch of strips of oak. Mine are 1.25 inches wide, but honestly, that's a completely arbitrary number. If you want to follow along at home, you can make them whatever width you want. Eventually, I ran out of oak and then switched over to walnut. I continued ripping until I felt that I had enough pieces for a complete tabletop. Then it was time to prepare for the coming mess. I cut a piece of vapor barrier to cover my assembly table and then started working on my pattern. A full piece of walnut and a full piece of oak bookended either side, and then I started filling in the middle with progressively smaller pieces. The idea here was to make it look like the walnut was slowly transitioning to oak and vice versa. There's really no wrong way to do this, so I just played around with the pattern and had some fun with it. So why was I so concerned about precision earlier? Well, in the end, I had 24 rows of wood, and even a small 0.1 degree of error would have compounded across all of those rows and made for a very warpy tabletop. Thankfully though, everything looked good and I was ready for a truly massive glue up. Rather than trying to be precise here, I opted for a carpet bombing approach. I threw down a ton of glue and then just spread it out using a roller. I did this because you only get like 20 minutes before wood glue starts to set up, so it was a bit of a race against the clock and I had to make every second count. Once I had the glue evenly distributed, I began rolling over all my pieces and then started applying the clamps, which again, in the name of saving time, I had pre-sized before applying any glue. So while we wait for this to dry, why don't we cut the bottom of the coffee table over on the CNC, because that's where a lot of the magic in this project is going to happen. This bottom panel is going to play a big role in what separates this coffee table from every other run-of-the-mill coffee table. In the bottom of it, I carved 3 things. First was this rather large air intake. This will allow cool air to be sucked up and into the bottom of the table. Second was a bunch of small circular cutouts that will help me to manage wires. And then finally, we have this small channel that goes the whole way around the perimeter for even more LED lighting. Well, when you look at that, that is the bottom of our coffee table done, and there's all sorts of fun cutouts in this, as you can see, for some fun stuff later. But first, let's talk about the tabletop. So our glue is now dry, and this whole thing is one solid piece, which is pretty cool. Here, let me demonstrate. Yeah, there we go, see? Unfortunately, the surface of it is a little bit rough, and obviously these ends leave something to be desired. So I think now we have to clean this up a little bit. Trying to glue together a perfectly square tabletop is a fool's errand. I always opt to just run my boards a little bit long and then cut everything square afterwards with my track saw. It wastes a bit of material, but trust me, it is much better than the alternative. After that was done, I had to take care of the surface of my table. Small variations in the height of all those individual pieces made for a very rough surface. True, I could have sanded everything flat with a belt sander, but why do that when you can just use a drum sander, which is essentially like a giant belt sander attached to a conveyor belt. It took more than a few passes, but what I was left with was a perfectly flat and smooth tabletop that was ready for the next step. Receiving a light round over with the trim router to help improve ergonomics and make it a little bit gentler on the hands. Now that we're done with the top, we can marry it with the bottom, except we're gonna have to kind of fix a little mistake that I made earlier. I want this top to be able to raise off the bottom. And in order to make that work, I got these lift top hinges, but that trim piece that I installed earlier on the inside, well, it's kind of in the way. That trim prevents the hardware from sitting flush against the side of the box. So in order to fix that, I had to add a small spacer block on either side. And don't worry, I'm not just relying on glue and nails to hold it in place. I sized the mounting screws so that they would go through the block and into the plywood, making a nice strong sandwich. According to the specs for these hinges, they should be able to support up to 150 pounds, so theoretically that should be plenty for our coffee table top and anything that happens to be resting on top of it. With the last couple of screws in place, it was time to give the whole thing a test and just see how it worked. So let's see. Oh yeah, that's nice. I think we're in business. Now let me show you a little detail that I kind of left out before. I'm sure many of you have probably noticed that I have these little wood spacers in every corner. And that's because when this lid closes, I want it to sit a 1/4 inch up off of the base. And that way air can circulate through and up out of the box. And that is going to be very important for some of the stuff we're going to be doing later. But for now, let's get into a little bit of finishing. Today, we are going to be trying something a little bit new, or at least new for me. If you've been watching any woodworking videos in the last 5 years or so on YouTube, you've probably seen a ton of this stuff. It's Rubio Monocoat. I just haven't really given it a fair shake before, so I bought a bottle and we're gonna test it on this project. I think the first thing that you have to know about Rubio Monocoat is that the name is basically a complete lie. Everyone I've talked to says it works best if you apply at least 2 coats of it. And the lies don't stop there either. I got the white tinted version, and if you look on their website, they say that it looks like this on white oak. And I think that you can see in real life, it really doesn't. At least not on the white oak hardwood. It kind of gets there on the plywood. Overall, I am still pretty happy with how it turned out, but I don't know how it gained this reputation as the gold standard for woodworking finishes. Ooh, okay, Rubio Monocoat, that is not bad looking at all. It's got a little bit less sheen to it than I expected. That being said, I actually kind of really enjoy this matte finish that it has. Now that that's out of the way, why don't we start putting this thing together and start putting some of the electronics into it. Wood shims are never a permanent solution, so in order to keep the top elevated that 1/4 inch above the base, I installed these rubber and felt pads in each corner. This gives us our ventilation and helps to make sure that the top doesn't slam shut when you close it. After that, I screwed everything back together and got ready to add a bit of lighting. One of the first kind of techie things that I want to install in this coffee table is a little bit of LED lighting. You remember earlier I made that L-shaped channel that went the whole way around the perimeter? Well, that's going to give us the perfect place to put this LED strip light, and then that way, whenever I open up the coffee table, it'll be illuminated, and also it's going to provide a little bit of accent lighting in the rest of the room, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so first, why don't we just start installing these? As a general rule of thumb, I do not trust the double-sided tape that comes pre-installed on LEDs. But thankfully, I was able to thread the strips under the spacer blocks, and they also came with their own reinforcing plastic clips. So fingers crossed they hold up long term. Once I had made it all the way around my trim piece, rather than ending the run, I actually turned it 90 degrees and went up the side of the box. Then I covered that section with a piece of wood, which seems a bit odd, but I wanted to take the rest of the strip and thread it up through and into the bottom panel. Now, unfortunately, this is the part of the project where I accidentally wasted a bunch of money. The bottom panel was a tight fit, so when it didn't slot right into position, I decided to give it a little love with the old mallet. And I think right about here, I ended up crimping the LED strip, which happened to be stuck between the bottom panel and the box. And also, I cut the strip a bit short here at one of the predetermined termination points, and I didn't really like how it looked, so off camera I ended up buying another set of LEDs and replacing this entire run. So yeah, just be careful with your LEDs and plan out where your termination points are going to end up before you start sticking anything down. Okay, let's give this a little test run. Yeah, let's give this a little test run. Oh, hey, there we go. Full unicorn vomit. Yeah, that looks good. We got the underglow on the side. We got it in here. It's not the brightest looking right now, but then again, you have to remember that this is a really bright light. I got a ton of overhead lights, windows, skylights. This is more of like a nighttime thing. It's not meant to illuminate the whole room. Overall, I'm very happy with that. And now I think we're ready to move on to do a little bit of cooling. Those of you who saw my laptop cooling pad video may remember the Noctua NF-A20. And what this is just, well, a really big computer fan. But the cool thing about it is because it's so big, the blades don't have to spin that fast in order to move a lot of air, which means that it's basically silent. So we're gonna take this guy, we're going to install it right about there, and it's going to draw cool air in from the bottom and exhaust hot air out the top, keeping all the electronics inside the coffee table perfectly cool. Just for fun, I actually crunched the numbers on this, and just one of these fans is capable of replacing all of the air inside the table every 6 seconds, which will be important because LEDs aren't the only thing going in there. So now the next thing we have to do is install my AV receiver. Now this thing is pretty neat. Not only does it power my surround sound setup with all my speakers getting screwed into these ports here, but also it acts as an HDMI hub. So I can take a whole bunch of inputs, plug them into this, and then have only one HDMI cable running from this to my TV, which is going to be really key later on. Theoretically, this should be very easy. Just open the top, grab the AV receiver, and lower it into position. Next, we have to install my PS5 because obviously I gotta have my games in here. However, we are going to run into a little bit of an issue because, yeah, the PS5 is too tall. I got a solution though. And this is why I think everybody needs to know how to weld. In order to mount my PS5 inside the box, I decided to just fabricate a custom bracket for it that holds it horizontally. I won't go into too much detail on the process here, but if you want to learn more, I've got a whole video all about how to get started in MIG welding, and I'll link that down in the video description. After the welding was done, I drilled some mounting holes in the steel, cleaned it up a bit outside with an angle grinder, and then sprayed on a coat of black paint. Oh, and then to keep everything matching nicely, I cut a piece of white oak, finished it with a Rubio, and then screwed it to the bracket. The result was this cute little shelf that sits directly above the AV receiver and perfectly fits the PS5. Oh man, I am pumped on how that looked. That looks so good. So at this point, I think we're basically done building stuff, but we are still far from done this project. I have a lot of surprises left to pack into this thing. So what do you say we change locations back to my living room and start getting this thing set up a little bit? So as you can see, we are back at home. The new coffee table is in place. The old one has been relegated over there to the corner. However, we still have a lot to do because all of this stuff over here has to go in there. And as you can see, there are an absolute ton of wires here. And I don't know about you guys at home, but I hate wires and I don't want to be able to see any of these by the time we're done. Oh, and also there's a little problem from earlier that I have to fix. Unfortunately, a slight miscalculation in the height of the fan led to it being a bit too close to the carpet for my comfort. So I added these adjustable legs that will allow me to raise the whole table up about 1/4 inch. Not ideal, but we'll talk more about that and other things I could have done better at the end of the video during the post-mortem analysis. On the plus side, at least these legs will allow me to level out the table on uneven floors. Okay, now I had to pull apart this entire room again. Yippee! The final location of the table is going to be important for this next step, so I marked it out with a little bit of tape and then cleared out all the furniture again. So the first thing I'm going to do here, and it feels very wrong to do this, is to cut a hole in this brand new carpet. This plan was conceptually very simple, but practically turned out to be a big pain in the butt. Utilizing the thickness of my carpet pad, I plan to hide all of my wires under the carpet. Now, for the thicker wires, like the HDMI and power strip, I cut a channel into the carpet pad. But for the much thinner gauge speaker wires, I just laid them down and then taped them flat. The tricky part was actually getting the wires through the carpet and then up into the coffee table. Pro tip, if you're gonna follow in my footsteps, get much longer wires than you think is necessary. Because I didn't have much slack, I had to kind of taco the carpet, pull the wires into the table, and then somehow get the carpet to lay flat without either of the layers bunching up. This was easily the hardest part of the whole project and honestly kind of broke me a couple of times. I'm just gonna live under here for a little bit. Me. Okay, keep going. But eventually I got it done and managed to get all of the wrinkles out of both layers of the carpet. So big whoop, right? I managed to get the wires to the wall, but I still had to get them up to the TV and to the plug. Well, that's where my tower speaker came in. They gave me the perfect cover to hide the wires. All it took was some cable management clips on the backside and a little bit of careful routing. I also installed a small power strip to power the TV and the bias light that I installed a couple of days prior. This thing is insanely cool. Basically, it's a ring of LEDs around your TV that extends the colors onto the wall behind it, creating an even more immersive experience. And I'll show you how it all works in a second. On the left side, I hooked up the second tower speaker and then ran the wire from my center channel up across the back of the TV and then down right in front of it. Mounting the center channel was a bit daunting at first, but then I remembered I owned a 3D printer. So I made my own custom French cleats and then hung it directly under the TV. Next, I decided I wanted somewhere to put all my various game controllers, so I got these fold-down mounts and then screwed them to the inside of the table. And speaking of screws, you know what's super annoying? Those keyhole mounts on the back of power strips. Here's an easy way that you can locate them. Simply mark the hole in some painter's tape and then transfer it to your mounting surface. I then connected everything back to my AV receiver and installed it alongside my custom Xbox Series Z, my yet-to-be modified PS5, and my Nintendo Switch Pro. Now, I'm sure many of you were worried about dust getting sucked inside of the table, so I also opted to install this dust filter over the fan, and it's on the inside too, which makes it easy to clean. And then finally, after 3 long months of not being able to enjoy my surround sound setup, I reconnected my rear speakers. And because I made the speaker stands myself, they're designed specifically to hide the wires. Can you tell I have a phobia of wires? A few little touches later, and I was finally ready to answer a couple of final questions. Well, it was a bit of an ordeal, but we finally got it all set up. And I mean, come on, look at this place. It's pretty seamless. And I mean that in both terms of how it looks and how it all functions. Let me show you how all this stuff plays together. First of all, the fan at the bottom of the coffee table. How do we make sure that it isn't just running all the time? Well, it's plugged into the USB port on the front of the receiver, and that USB port is only powered when the receiver is on. And thanks to the wonders of HDMI CEC, the receiver automatically turns on whenever anything else in the chain is also turned on. So whether I start the PS5 from the controller or the TV from the remote, everything that needs to be on will automatically do so. And that means that outside of the initial setup, I never have to interact with the receiver or its annoying remote ever again. No Megatron necessary.
The Megatron doesn't say urban freewheelers, it says sofa masturbators.
I also love having the lighting inside of the table. This is especially handy when you're trying to find something in here at night. And because they're smart lights, well, they integrate really well with my whole smart home setup. So I can control these lights from my phone, from the button inside of the case, or even with my voice if necessary. And if you're not sold on the whole Need for Speed underglow thing, well then you can turn off those lights individually with the app. And speaking of LED lighting, this bias light is like the best thing that ever happened to my home theater. It's especially great when you're gaming. I can highly recommend it, and I will include some links to it along with everything else in the video description. And outside of all the tech stuff, this whole space just now feels more open, less cluttered, and just cleaner overall. So I think that's enough of the good. Now let's talk about some of the bad in the post-mortem analysis. There's a couple of obvious f-ups, like had I made the legs a ½ inch longer, then I would have needed to add those legs on the bottom of the table. And had I positioned the cutouts on the bottom of it a little bit better, well, then I would have had to buy a new LED strip. But honestly, I think the biggest one is just cable management. There's a lot of wires in here, and I think either a false back or a false bottom to hide them all would have made things a lot cleaner. And then one last thing. I think maybe a second carpet pad or maybe just a thicker one, because if you're looking for it, you can sometimes feel some of the wires. Like, yeah, I think right here is the HDMI cable. I honestly might go back and do a little bit of carpet tape over all these to keep them down a little bit better. All right, that's it for me in this video. My next video is either going to be a customized, modernized Nintendo 64 or a custom ROG Pro video. Haven't quite decided, but either way, you're gonna wanna get subscribed so you don't miss either of those videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.